cuyo libro Irracionalidad, aquí lo tengo, tuve el placer de leer y reseñar. Es un texto que me entusiasmó enormemente por el amplio recorrido, la variedad de los temas que aborda, siempre en relación con esta oposición, ¿no? Lo racional, lo irracional, y la emergencia de esa oposición en distintos momentos de la cultura. Quería dar la bienvenida a Justin y comenzar haciéndole algunas preguntas sobre este texto, sobre la inspiración de este texto. Y una de las primeras cosas que observaba es que lo que parece haber inspirado este libro es un estado de cosas en lo político, en las redes, sumado a la experiencia de la pandemia. Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿cómo considera la pandemia desde el punto de vista de la irracionalidad y las conductas políticas, ¿no?, asociadas con la pandemia? Como si todo esto fuera el punto cúlmine de una razón protectora de los individuos, o como la explosión de la irracionalidad en el nivel individual y en el nivel de los estados, ¿no?, de las políticas.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me now? Yes. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening from Paris, and I'm delighted to jump right in to the questions as well. Indeed, this book emerges out of, I think, the gradual dawning over the course of the previous decade, of the 2010s, of certain new evident truths that were not apparent to me before. And I think I'm like many people in the world who didn't see certain things coming, that by 2015 or 16 were no longer possible to ignore. And the way I think of this now is that it was the ultimate death of a long optimistic dream that was held by a number of rationalist philosophers, one of whom in particular, an important figure for me, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who in the middle of the 17th century started envisioning the possibility of outsourcing reasoning processes to machines, letting machines do our thinking for us in ways that Leibniz thought in the 1670s would ultimately lead to a perfect structure of society and to such benefits as world peace, everlasting peace. And on my narrative, this dream that was expressed by Leibniz and other people at the dawn of the Enlightenment can be seen as extending from roughly 1676 until roughly 2015, when it became no longer possible to pretend that the outsourcing of our reasoning to machines was benefiting society in any way. And this is in part because what happened is that we outsourced or put into external prosthetics the very structures of our own thinking, in virtue of which society was already so dysfunctional to begin with. So in that respect, the convergence of internet technology and politics in the mid-2010s brought out in plain evidence the kind of duality of the human mind in a very vivid way. Now, as for the pandemic, this is a pre-pandemic book. It went to press before the pandemic started. I did manage to get a foreword into the paperback edition that kind of updated it to deal with the pandemic. And indeed, what I said there was that it seems to me now, I don't claim to be a prophet, but it seems to me now that the book was in ways that surprise me, kind of pregnant with the present moment, or an anticipation of certain forms of irrationality that are now even clearer in the way society has split into the kind of volunteer mask enforcers on the one hand and the anti-vaxxers on the other. It's all just that much more of a kind of vivid, real world demonstration of the book's basic argument.
Bien, efectivamente, estos efectos de la pandemia serían un momento cúlmine de una crisis, ¿no es cierto? Que sin duda tiene que ver con la aparición de estas máquinas que ofician de prótesis externas cognitivas. Eso está muy bien desplegado en el libro, también la delegación a esas máquinas de ciertas formas del vínculo. Ahora bien, dado que la máquina, no la máquina en abstracto, sino estas máquinas, son también hijas de esa modernidad. ¿Usted considera que la razón moderna que sostuvo el imaginario de las máquinas está hoy en una suerte de eclipse gracias al sobredimensionamiento de la máquina, o que se va a sostener frente a los embates actuales?
Well, I think obviously I have on occasion, and let me just add that not to jump ahead, but I have a new book coming out this winter called The Internet is Not What You Think It Is, also from Princeton University Press, which develops further some of the less developed reflections on contemporary technology that are in irrationality. And I have been, in my various public interventions on this topic, I have been accused by people who I think grossly misunderstand of Ludditism, that is, of following in the footsteps of the likely fictional, what's his name? Nicholas Ludd, I forget his exact name, the Englishman in the Industrial Revolution who supposedly went and smashed up new industrial machines in the factories out of a hatred of technological progress. In fact, that's not, Ned Ludd was his name, Ned Ludd. In fact, that's not why he smashed the machines. He smashed them because they were taking away people's jobs. So it wasn't a hatred of technology in itself, it was a hatred of the social impact of the technologies. And certainly I agree with, I think the philosopher Daniel Dennett puts this very nicely, there has never been a single evolutionary adaptation or technological advance that is not both a gain and a loss, that doesn't come with negative and generally unforeseen consequences. That's just the nature of advances, whether natural or artificial. And obviously, no one in the present moment, well, I mean, I guess a few very extreme figures, anarcho-primitivists and people I don't generally have interviews with, though one never knows, other than a very very small number of people, no one thinks we're going back from our current technological arrangement. And the only question remains then, how do we make it work for us? How do we make it function rationally according to our wills rather than dominating us? But that said, there may be in the present moment some productive reckoning with the inadequacies of this long, what I described as Leibnizian optimistic dream of technological prosthetics perfecting society for us. We've learned the hard lesson that they're not going to perfect society, and now that combined with ecological crisis and maybe also with real enduring concerns about the epidemiology in the future will lead to a more rational use of technological solutions to human problems. That's how I would describe it.
Bien, Ned Ludd, los luditas, se engarzaban de algún modo con el imaginario moderno que tenía esta doble vertiente, tecnofóbica y... Sí, Ned Ludd, quien fue mencionado recién, el supuesto cabecilla inexistente del movimiento ludita, se engarzaba con un imaginario tecnológico en donde florecían las tecnofobias y las tecnofilias. Y todo eso venía de la mano también, respecto de la máquina, de una mirada que implementaba la lógica del amo y el esclavo, ¿no? Las máquinas estaban ahí para obedecernos, o bien se podían sublevar. Nuestras lógicas de redes asoman como algo inquietantemente diferente, ¿no? Entonces la pregunta es, ¿habrá un nuevo tipo de lógica derivada de nuestra escritura palimpséstica en redes, o bien de las prácticas que estamos desplegando en esas mismas redes? De esto vamos a hablar después, pero por ejemplo, algo que usted señala muy bien en el libro, el hecho de que Internet se haya convertido en un campo de la no jerarquización, de la irracionalidad, en el sentido de la lógica argumentativa, que cualquiera pueda decir cualquier cosa sin fundamentos. Sin embargo, parece haber una lógica, aunque más no sea económica, en el sostén de eso. ¿Qué opina de esta nueva relación con la máquina?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a really important point, and we need to distinguish between the kind of intrinsic limitations of this new communications technology as a medium for rational discourse on the one hand, and on the other hand, the limitations that result from the economic model that governs it, right? In particular, the fact that there are just a handful of private corporations that are ultimately only in it for profit, and for that reason have an incentive to stoke disagreement, because disagreement increases user engagement, and therefore, in a sense, to do everything that is the opposite of what one would expect in the conditions, kind of broadly speaking, Habermasian conditions of deliberative democracy, or in the public space. So that's why recently I've been saying, and this sounds very extreme, but that we all have a responsibility as citizens or as global citizens to not use social media to argue for things we believe in. But then it becomes paradoxical. It's almost as if I'm saying we have a duty to use social media only to, as they say, shitpost or to tell jokes or something like that. That's all it's good for. right? Because if you take it seriously as a medium for deliberative democracy, as the public space, then effectively what you're doing is you're, as I've come to put it more recently, what you're doing is you're playing a deliberative democracy themed video game, right? It's a video game that has the theme of political engagement in the same way that, say, Space Invaders has the theme of shooting alien invaders, right? It's not the thing itself, it's a game that is meant to remind you of the thing.
Bien, ¿cómo se puede construir un zócalo común para lo político cuando se pivotea entre la creencia de cada individuo de intervenir según su propio deseo y su hedonismo y la lógica del algoritmo, que es también, como decíamos, la lógica del capital, ¿no? Porque esta cuestión del hedonismo y el discurso del deseo por un lado y el aprovechamiento de eso en términos mercantiles parece ser un esquema muy provechoso y que cierra por todos lados. ¿Qué lugar deja eso a la construcción común de lo político?
I mean, I suppose this is really getting to the heart of the problem. And it's, in fact, what I've been thinking about more with my more recent book. You really have three options. I know some very politically engaged people who are perfectly at ease just going ahead and saying, join the strike, or vote for X or vote for Y on Twitter or Facebook, and just ignoring the various imperfections of these media. What are the other options besides that? Well, I suppose there is the approach that is closer to hacker culture, which is something I'm also not a part of, but that continues to use technology, but to subvert it in ways that the people who attempted to structure it for their own profit do not want to happen. Like, say, Aaron Swartz liberating the reserves of JSTOR so that everyone could have access to scholarship that's ordinarily behind paywalls. And then he was hounded until he committed suicide. So that's one way of continuing to engage. But then beyond that, like, obviously, if you're to accept my admonition and say, okay, I'll stop using the main channels of the internet for legitimate political ends, what else are you going to do? Print pamphlets in your basement as if it were the 1920s? That also seems like it's an ineffective thing to do. So I suppose in the present moment, there really are no good answers. And I don't mean to sound like a pessimist, but it could just be that the new information ecosystem we're living in is so radically different and so set up against the kind of collective pursuit of our social good that we would want, that it would really be premature to make positive proposals about how to get around this problem. I mean, at a very practical, non-philosophical level, I can say that even, you know, the difficult question as it comes up in the United States, which is the situation. I mean, I know the Western European and US situations the best. In the United States, should the Senate tackle the big tech companies more aggressively to break up their monopolies and the other ways they've been getting around lax laws in the United States for the past 20 years. Yes, the government probably should do that. Would it be successful? I think it's probably too late. Well, should the government do something more aggressive and seize Facebook and turn it into a public utility? I don't know. I mean, I can see the advantages, obviously, of reconceiving social media as a public utility akin to electricity, but I'm also very unwilling to start making concrete, radical policy proposals of that sort without reflecting on all the consequences I haven't anticipated.
Bien, hay también un cambio de actitud de parte de los ciudadanos en relación con la idea de sus propias diferencias. No parecen ya estar dispuestos a subsumir su diferencia a una construcción, como decíamos, común, sino a poner esa diferencia delante de todo. Esto podría ser un dato más si no fuese por el detalle de que la diferencia del otro, cuando se expresa bajo la forma de una opinión en redes, despierta una cancelación, un castigo, etcétera. Usted lo trabaja muy bien en el libro también, y se refiere a acciones de espíritu maoísta, ¿no? Pero proliferantes en un nivel subestatal. ¿Qué puede ampliar un poco este asunto de las lógicas maoístas?
Sure. Well, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, and I might regret having said that. But in a broad sense, there is certainly something Maoist about the idea that someone who does not share your belief commitments is someone who ipso facto needs to be, as people like to say in American social media, educated, right? Rather than considering the possibility that the reason that person doesn't share your commitments is that they have substantive, principled disagreement with you, right? And so it seems to me that over the past decade, and I think indeed empirical studies show this, in the United States and Western Europe, belief in the importance of the survival of, let's say, traditional liberal freedoms as they emerged in the Enlightenment really is weakening. And they're weakening more and more the younger the people polled are, so that young people in larger numbers today, as opposed to 1968, say, really are prepared to say that beliefs the beliefs of citizens ought, in certain cases, to be compelled. That is to say, if citizens don't hold those beliefs, then the state needs to move in to see that they come to hold those beliefs, right? And the fact that this is emerging now, and as you rightly quote me, that it's emerging at a sub-state level, that is, it emerges on social media first, and then people try to push people who hold these same views into office subsequently, does strike me as something like a revolutionary moment. Does this revolution bring any good? And I think here perhaps I was less generous or less balanced than I could have been in the book. If you look at the United States, there is indeed an argument that, well, if we have, as some people like Ibram X. Kendi are proposing now, a ministry of anti-racism with a panel of unelected officials who will weed out all instances of racism wherever it occurs. This would be a significant step backwards for the First Amendment in the US context, but it might help eradicate racism, right? So if, or it might help diminish racism, let's be more realistic. So if that's the case, then it might be that we are looking at a genuine trade-off here, and which side you think is more important might be a genuine substantive issue that we're currently fighting out on social media. But in any case, and here I think I'm confident pointing, saying I can point to empirical studies that show as much. Social media has eroded, has diminished our societies, probably global societies, belief in the kind of rock bottom principle of toleration of disagreement. And that indeed is quasi-Maoist, I would argue.
Bien, antes de volver a la cuestión de Estados Unidos, porque en un momento le quiero preguntar sobre Donald Trump, pero antes, para que los lectores también tengan un panorama general, le pregunto, ¿cómo eligió para cada capítulo el ángulo desde el cual abordar el problema de la irracionalidad? Porque cuento en general, para quienes no han podido todavía leer el libro, que hay una zona dedicada al onírico, otra al arte, después, al humor. Hay una serie de aristas desde la cual se evalúa cómo se dio la lucha entre lo racional y lo irracional para llegar al tiempo presente y a esto que estamos debatiendo sobre las redes. ¿Cómo fueron elegidos esos aspectos? ¿Por qué esos y no por qué otros?
Well, I suppose, I mean, it's the politics part that gets the most traction, that people want to talk about most, and that's okay. But I am first and foremost a philosopher. And so when I want to tackle a topic that is as broad as irrationality, the way I go about doing this is, I mean, it's kind of like Aristotle, who would say something like, in how many different ways is irrationality said? Let me enumerate those ways. And so that's effectively what I tried to do. And I came up with 7 or 8 or 9, I forget how many chapters, and then each chapter more or less engaging one of those instances. And I wanted very much to focus at least a good portion of the book on the senses of irrationality that are ambiguous. We don't know whether it's good or bad, but that are also more kind of distinctly human and individual, right? And so this is but that also, if you think about them, can have significant political implications as well in the way that we understand them. So at the narrowest, irrationality is simply violating the laws of logic, right? It's believing that, I don't know, both X and not X or something like that. And since Greek antiquity, a high kind of moral premium, a moral value has been cultivated in some parts of the world, particularly in European institutions of learning and their outposts that, says you have to not do that. You have to respect the laws of logic. And this is almost, a sense in which being rational is just part of from an anthropological point of view, just part of a broader scheme of having good manners, right? But of course, there are problems, or this is difficult to maintain in a thoroughgoing way. As I point out early in the book, for one thing, we're organic beings. We have to sleep for 5 to 8 hours out of every 24, and when we do that, we lose control over the torrent of representations that our minds produce for us, and we systematically violate the laws of logic all the time when we're dreaming. Right? So dreams then become a very useful kind of point of access to think about the relationship between rationality and irrationality over the past several centuries. And of course, if you think about the paradigmatic rationalist modern philosopher, René Descartes, a lot of his project, you might say, is that of ensuring himself and all of us that he's not dreaming, that he does spend some time dreaming each day, but he's very well able to, once he wakes up, pack that little part of his day away and put it aside as irrelevant to who he actually is, right? Now, we also know that not every culture does this. Many cultures take their dreams as revelatory, as guides for planning future action, as playing a role in the structuring of social life. And cultures that do that also survive. It's not like it's stupid to do it. If it were stupid, they would stop doing it, right? And so then, in a sense, the one way of understanding this opposition is it's an opposition regarding the different ways of managing irrationality. And then, so dreams are like paradigmatic irrationality, but then there are other things that are quasi-dream-like, taking drugs or being emotionally moved by music, or going to a violent political protest, or indeed going to a Trump rally. All of these share in the same broad genus that I wanted to give an account of in the book from many different perspectives and at many different levels, from the very personal to the global and political.
Y está muy bien logrado, entiendo, desde el momento en que se entiende, por un lado, que parece haber ciertas reglas de la lógica inmutables desde hace 2500 años, el principio de no contradicción y otras cosas, pero que, mientras tanto, se van desplegando distintos modelos de razón, porque cada vez que se habla de la irracionalidad o de un aspecto de la irracionalidad, se está dibujando también en negativo el tipo de razón correspondiente. Y es sumamente interesante toda la meditación que usted hace alrededor del humor, de cómo funcionó el humor como aliciente del pensamiento y la inteligencia en la modernidad, y cómo usted mismo cambió de posición respecto de su valoración del humor cuando vio, por ejemplo, cómo ciertas derechas utilizaban, hacían memes, ¿no? Y utilizaban elementos provenientes de esta tradición humorística, pero esta vez al servicio de entronizar figuras que pensaríamos imposibles y que sin embargo están ahí, como la de Donald Trump. ¿Puede ampliar un poquito más esto?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked me this. I just learned today that I received a grant for a project jointly between France and scholars in the UK on democracy and satire. So I'm going to be working on these questions more. And indeed, 20 years or so ago, I was kind of a naive, again, in the American context, a naive First Amendment absolutist, in that I thought that lèse-majesté, as we say in France, or lampooning figures in power, always serves a salutary function and should always be every citizen's right. And there was a satirical newspaper that still exists in the United States called The Onion, that I forget, it made some joke about dysfunctional politics in Washington, D.C. And then the Chinese state news agency reported this as truth. And then later they were informed, the Chinese state news agency was informed that this is a satirical newspaper. And then the newspaper in China made an announcement to the effect that, well, what do you expect under decadent and immoral capitalism that people would play such foolish jokes, or something like that. But what's remarkable to me now is that 20 years later, I almost sympathize with the Chinese perspective on this matter. Why is this? Well, because we no longer have just one or two or three known familiar satirical magazines in any given national context. Rather, what we have is, countless social media feeds that are run anonymously that are generating stuff that can be, nominally passed by under the heading of satire, but that are truly nothing more than disinformation, right? So I'm talking about, delirious things like a social media account that will give you a photograph of Denzel Washington, the actor, and it will say Barack Obama underneath it, or a photograph of Helen Mirren, the actress, and it will say Queen Elizabeth. And these are probably being generated by bots or by some artificial intelligence. They are like imitating human humor in that they're noticing a resemblance and giving you a juxtaposition that's slightly off. But when that kind of image is kind of overloading our information systems, and there are many examples that are more noxious than the two that I just gave you, you can no longer call it satire at all. That's just, a distortion of what that word means. So I almost feel as though, in the same way that, sometimes people say in the American context, when the Second Amendment to the Constitution, the right to bear arms, to weapons, when that was written in the late 18th century, what they had in mind were 18th century muskets that you had to reload each time. Similarly, one might say of the First Amendment, of the right to free speech and satire, in particular, as a variety of free speech, that our 21st century information reality could not possibly have been anticipated in the Enlightenment. So I don't want to say, just give up and say, let's start banning certain types of speech. But I do want to say that we really have to think about how the Enlightenment principle of free speech is facing new challenges in this new information ecosystem.
Y una lógica satírica como la que maneja Charlie Hebdo, por ejemplo, ¿qué opinión le merece?
Yeah. Well, Charlie Hebdo, actually, that one of the most kind of compelling things that I read around that time in 2015, and of course, some of this makes it into the book, was written by one of the survivors of the editorial staff, who said, look, when we started our jobs here, everyone who read Charlie Hebdo knew what Charlie Hebdo is all about, knew what it was, knew what we do, and if they didn't like it, they didn't pick up a copy. And so they had their kind of, they're faithful, and then they had people for whom it was off the radar. And it was definitely off the radar of jihadists in Syria. But what was happening by 2015 was that images were circulating globally in ways that nobody could anticipate when they were released into the world. Certainly this going back some years earlier, but the reason Charlie Hebdo fell on the bad side of the radical Islamists was that Charlie Hebdo came to the defense of a local Danish newspaper around 2010, when this Danish newspaper published its mediocre blasphemous cartoons against Islam. They were really of poor quality. This was in a local context in Denmark where they were surprised that this exploded onto the internet. They didn't expect this to happen. So Charlie Hebdo felt as a matter of principle, we have to join our Danish comrades in the press in solidarity. So over the course of this decade, then, it became reasonable to expect that your speech can no longer be expected to remain within the speech context where it started. And indeed, that has also been the explanation for a lot of so-called cancellations, right? When people say something believing that their 20 friends in high school are going to be the ones who hear it, and then it gets circulated millions of times. So there is a scale of exposure that is distorting our personal expectations of ourselves and the way we use speech, but that's also making it impossible to hold on to the earlier idea of, let's say, private speech communities. So, but notice everything I just said, I remain totally neutral in at least what I just said about where I stand on Charlie Hebdo. I mean, this is, this is just an analysis that I think remains valid, whether you think they should have had the right to publish those cartoons or not.
Bien, hay algo interesante porque justamente el tema de Charlie Hebdo convoca la discusión, que sería muy amplia y que posiblemente no la despleguemos ahora, sobre los fanatismos religiosos y nada, una serie de modos de denominar ciertas conductas. Pero me interesa en cada uno, en cada individuo, en cada sujeto, y no necesariamente por lo religioso, la aparición de conductas de tipo fanática alrededor de la defensa de cualquier tema de la vida cotidiana y cualquier debate menor. La posición subjetiva, perdón por usar esta palabra más técnica, la posición subjetiva se convierte en la posición fanática. ¿Qué nos está diciendo eso acerca de nuestro modo de vincularnos y discutir?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think and maybe, maybe it's not so much a matter of a deterioration of the standards of public discourse, as it is simply that I, perhaps you, perhaps some other people here experienced our early years, or I won't speak for anyone else, I experienced my early years in a period of, let's say, American history where there seemed to be, or where one could easily have believed in the presence of an enduring establishment run more or less by grown-ups, right? That is to say that somewhere back there, there were some authority figures making rational judgment calls at crucial moments, right? And they kept messing things up. They certainly messed things up in American foreign policy, and I'm aware of all of this. And yet, nonetheless, there was a feeling that, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a banal way to put it, but that somewhere back there, there were grown-ups running the show, right? And part of this, what I think I personally now take to be an illusion of childhood, part of this illusion that I had in childhood came from the projection of authority in media, such as media were, say, in the last quarter of the 20th century, right? And when this projection of authority collapses, and there's no longer, let's say, the same television networks that everybody watches, but now there are choices of news networks that people make according to what their political preferences are in advance. Then you have people kind of spiraling deeper and deeper into their preferred information environment. And when that happens, it starts to look like all of this is extremism. Everyone is an extremist, even if they are committed to the idea of themselves that they believe moderate, rational, centrist things. And you certainly see this, I think, and I'm sorry to keep going back to the American case, but again, it's just the one that I analyze most closely. You certainly see this among, let's say, the dead-enders of the establishment Democratic Party, right? The people who had so much trauma in accepting Hillary Clinton's loss in the 2016 election and continued as dead-enders in a vision of their political party as it was shaped by the Clintons in the past few decades, rather than adapting and moving on to the new political reality that country is facing. And so when you see that happen, when you see people becoming dead-enders, even about things that are, not Islamic Jihad or not Maoism, but rather just kind of just kind of mainstream politics, it seems reasonable to suppose that this has something to do with the fact that even mainstream politics, whether it's worth supporting or not, and again, I'm not holding forth on that here, that supporting mainstream politics now involves a kind of burrowing, like a small mammal that lives underground, burrowing into your preferred information community, again, in a way that leaves us in this new technological reality in a condition where everyone seems like an extremist.
Bien, una pregunta más también y vamos a ir invitando al público a que piense alguna pregunta para compartir. Es muy interesante cómo usted trabaja la aparición de ciertos movimientos en redes como los terraplanistas, los antivacunas, ¿no? Y cómo esos individuos no solamente confrontan con este principio de autoridad moderna, sino que también buscan asumir la posición de ser quienes revelan una verdad supuestamente oculta hasta este momento por un gran complot, no sé, de los estados, de la ciencia, lo que fuere, ¿no? Y esto también lleva al punto de incluso negar, dice usted, cuestiones que competen a la propia biología. O sea que en última instancia parece estar habiendo una lucha por la verdad, ¿no? Una verdad estallada, como dice usted, en 1000 puntos de vista. ¿Ven estos movimientos como los antivacunas o los terraplanistas un peligro o simplemente lo toma como una erupción de irracionalidad?
Well, you know, the truth is I've kind of developed a sympathy for flat earthers. I think they're kind of sweet. And if you listen to them, what you hear from them generally is pretty quickly, at least for many of them, a confession that they don't actually believe that the earth is flat. But rather that they simply reject the expectation from authority that we will just lap up whatever account of the cosmos is offered. And in a way, it's like a gateway drug into thinking about the history of cosmology and the Copernican revolution and Ptolemaic astronomy. And, you know, these are kind of self-made intellectuals who are talking all about it on YouTube. And, you know, they seem like harmless, decent people who will probably grow out of it, right? And so you really have to, I think, study conspiracy theories on a case-by-case basis. And they have very different political, ideological resonances for very different complicated reasons. Some, I think, you know, it's hard to detect any obvious kind of right-wing ideological dog whistling in the flat earth movement. By contrast, also I think the anti-vax movement is very interestingly ideologically a jumble, much like the so-called gilets jaunes or the yellow vest populist movement in France. It's hard to pinpoint where this lies precisely on the ideological spectrum. And again, anti-vaxxers are very much like that as well. But obviously, when everyone is kind of going in for their favorite conspiracy, it's pretty worrisome. But then again, on the other hand, what I see now as the illusion of my childhood that I alluded to earlier, when everyone's believing the same authority as giving the undisputed truth, that's not good either, right? So in a way, the efflorescence of conspiracy theories in the present moment might be a symptom of a broader social transformation out of which new kind of epistemic sensibility will emerge.
Bien, bueno, podemos abrir entonces el espacio a algunas preguntas que nos van llegando. Voy a transmitirlas entonces. Patricia señala que hay que tener en cuenta que cada uno tiene su razón, ¿no? Sin confundir el plano de la ética. Digamos que el ser humano es irracional muchas veces por su emoción y por sus sesgos particulares, y quiere saber entonces la opinión de Justin Smith sobre esta tensión, imagino, entre la emoción personal y la ética general, si traduzco bien la pregunta.
Well, I mean, it's complicated, and I mean, that's a great question. And obviously it's complicated, and different philosophers have different positions on this problem. There are philosophers who think that, you know, you should kind of train your faculty of reason to dominate your emotions. I tend to be more sympathetic to the views of David Hume, who says very explicitly that that reason is best when it's, and these are Hume's words, a slave to the passions. Right? Now, not just any kind of directionless or any kind of multi-directional explosion of the passions, but obviously cultivated passions, right? So kind of becoming an adult is learning to cultivate your passions in a way that that is not incompatible with reason. And once you are in such a state, enslaving the reason to the passions can be beneficial to you. I don't have it so easily worked out. I think, you know, one thing that's been interesting to me recently is a scholarship on addiction and also bad habits. And, you know, some of us, I think definitely myself included, do things we would rather not do and do things we know are harmful to us. But all the while, in some cases, we have a very legitimate inner dialogue going on. Is this harmful thing I'm doing worth it? And we often, I think, go through extended kind of meditations about all the reasons why it could be worth it. But then again, maybe I'd do better giving it up. So these are, you know, what I think I portray in the book as legitimately hard questions, not questions that I think any competent philosopher or any honest philosopher would dare to claim to be able to answer.
Bien, justamente sobre esta cuestión de lo que nos hace mal, sobre esta cuestión yo empecé la lectura del libro también pensando en esa tensión con la muerte delante y lo que vale la pena ser vivido y cómo cada uno va eligiendo ese camino. Hay otra pregunta acá de Osvaldo. ¿Qué relación habría entre la irracionalidad y el individualismo, hedonismo, digamos, ¿no? En Occidente, perdón.
Well, I mean, look, I suppose, you know, one kind of lost strain of thought, and you know, these are very nebulous notions. What we're talking about when we're talking about Western culture is never entirely clear, especially when we're talking about its you know, the modern period when Western culture gets imposed in varying degrees of thoroughness in other regions of the world, but also when we're talking about antiquity. And, you know, obviously Greek moral theory, classical Greek moral theory is a very important element of the background to thinking about these issues for me. And one kind of ethical tradition
Bien.
that has been lost is the eudaimonistic ethics, that is eudaimonia, or the condition of having, let's say, a good state of the soul, or good demons in one, so to speak. And that is an ethical theory that basically says that, look, what ethics is about being happy. And if you're not happy, you're probably going to be a jerk to everybody. So just make sure you're happy, right? And that seems to be overwhelmingly the understanding of ethics that prevailed in antiquity. And it's only gradually, obviously with Christianity, but more particularly with Kant in the Enlightenment, that ethics becomes first and foremost the question of what are my duties to others, right? So the idea that happiness, or the cultivation of your own happiness, is somehow the same thing as selfishness or hyper-individualism, I think, I'm not saying that was claimed in the question. I'm just saying that's a common view that people presuppose today. That idea is really, I think, problematized when we look at the prevailing understanding of ethics in antiquity.
Bien. Hay otra pregunta más de Fernando. ¿Está de acuerdo usted con la clasificación de Spinoza de pasiones tristes y pasiones alegres?
Oh, that's a very specific question. I'm not much of a Spinozist myself. I'm more of a Leibnizian. I teach Spinoza every semester, and I try to do my best, mostly with the first two books of the Ethics, whereas the discussion of the passions comes in, I think, book 4. And I mean, I do recognize the respects in which Spinoza is pretty good at kind of reducing what looks more complex in terms of like the way we exercise our will over our bodies to something more basic, which is to say the passions. And I think the analysis that Spinoza gives of freedom, whereby freedom is a sort of agreeable sentiment that accompanies the determinate unfolding of things, sometimes is a pretty plausible theory. But so what can I say? I'm sympathetic to it. I wouldn't go so far as to say I agree with it.
Bien, y otra pregunta de Fernando, otro Fernando. ¿Considera que el irracionalismo en nuestras sociedades contemporáneas es una reacción a una pérdida de fe en el progreso que prometía la Ilustración, por haber derivado esto en una razón instrumental, ¿no es cierto?
Well, I mean, I suppose that's kind of what I was saying early on in my discussion with Margarita, that you can look at the trajectory of an idea like the externalization of rationality, or the outsourcing of rationality in machines, as it extends from Leibniz, who is the ultimate Enlightenment thinker. No one can be more Enlightenment than Leibniz, and as it ultimately fails in the early 21st century, indeed, yeah, we're facing up to the failure of Enlightenment dreams. But then again, the criticism of the Enlightenment, in some sense, it starts with the Enlightenment itself, with the so-called counter-Enlightenment of people like Herder. And by the time of the emergence of the Marxist tradition, and then in the early 20th century with figures like Adorno, the kind of the limits of faith in Enlightenment progress are kind of standard and familiar. And yet, that said, sometimes it seems as if nothing has shifted since Adorno and Horkheimer wrote The Dialectic of Enlightenment, because I can cite someone whose books sell far better than mine, Steven Pinker, who is an example of a thoroughgoing proponent of the victory of the Enlightenment in the present era. More people agree with him than with a worried, conflicted skeptic like me, who thinks the Enlightenment was pretty good, but also kind of a failure, right? So, if it comes down to who's more popular, me or Steven Pinker, if that's how we determine whether the Enlightenment is a success, then you could say the Enlightenment is a success. I'm kind of joking here, but you get the idea.
Bien, hay una pregunta por acá de Eduardo. ¿Qué reflexión le merece que canales supuestamente de divulgación científica estén detonados por la difusión de programas pseudocientíficos? New Age, bueno, terraplanistas que hablamos hace un rato, mitificadores, conspirativistas, etc.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about this a little bit already, and I think, the answer to Margarita was something I could develop a bit further, certainly, which is that, if you look at, again, the proliferation of conspiracy theories, flat earthers are obviously the most extreme, right? It is really a bold claim to make. It's much bolder than, say, creationism, because it concerns the present reality. It concerns something that presumably you can empirically disconfirm every time you go up in an airplane and so on, right? So it's really extreme. But then, there are all sorts of degrees of extremity. Just to cite something else, the recent explosion of interest in UFOs, in unidentified flying objects in the United States, also in France. France has been big on UFOs recently. The thing is, strictly speaking, there really are UFOs. If you take the term literally, there really are objects that are flying and we don't know what they are, right? They're probably spy satellites or space junk or something like that. I'm confident they aren't alien spacecraft. But this is very different from flat eartherism, because it's something where we're like, hey, there's something here we don't understand. Now, where things get really problematic, though, is if you look at a case like ivermectin, the horse deworming medicine that some anti-vaxxers have been proposing instead of Pfizer and Moderna and these other COVID vaccines. Ivermectin is not a vaccine. It doesn't work against COVID, but you can certainly find a lot of scientific looking studies with just a few Google searches that will give you the information you want to go on trying to convince your friends that ivermectin is more effective than a COVID vaccine. And that really only differs in kind from flat eartherism, right? Because you can also find studies, but usually more like YouTube videos that give you evidence that the earth is flat. The difference with ivermectin is that you really do have quantitative papers that reproduce the forms of scholarly peer review and stuff like that. And the real crisis, you might say in that regard, is not so much conspiracy theory, it's the explosion of pseudo peer-reviewed sources of information, right? It's the explosion of junk scholarly journals, which again, and just to tie this in with the humor discussion, it gets even more problematic because, you know, on strict kind of First Amendment absolutist grounds, you could say, well, maybe these junk peer review journals are actually satire, right? And then, you know, you're back with another of the currently intractable problems of irrationality in our contemporary society.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Justin. Fue un placer esta conversación. No sé si hay alguna cuestión más que usted quiera señalar o no, pero le agradecemos enormemente el diálogo.
No, I'm very grateful. This was really worthwhile, and I'm sorry for my confusion in the beginning. I didn't know what was happening when everyone was speaking Spanish. I hope you'll read my book, and I also hope maybe my next book about the internet will also be translated into Spanish, and I'm delighted to be read there.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Yes, gracias.
Hasta luego a todos, todas.
Thank you. Bye-bye.